All right, now let's take a look at my solution. So here we have this HTML element constructor function. We have a simple method here, click. We also have this focus method, which is defined on the prototype of HTML element. So this is our parent object. Now below that, we have another constructor, HTML select element. Note that I have initialized this items parameter to an empty array. This is something that we can do in ES6. Before ES6, we had to do something like this. So if items is defined, we would use that. Otherwise, we would use an empty array. Now with ES6, we can initialize the parameter, so this syntax is cleaner. So we set the items array here. We also have two methods, add item and remove item. The implementations are pretty straightforward. So in add item, I simply push an item to this array. And in remove item, I simply use the splice method to delete an item at the given position. This is just basic JavaScript. Now let's look at the important and tricky part of this exercise. That's the tricky part. We set the prototype of this HTML select element to an instance of an HTML element object. Earlier in this section, we used a different approach. So we use object.create and passed, let's say, HTML element.prototype. But this will not work in the current implementation. Let me explain why. Here, object.create will create a new object and set the prototype of that object to the prototype of HTML element. For discussion's sake, let's call the prototype of HTML element as base HTML element. So this is an object that has only one method. Look, here is the prototype of HTML element. It's an object with only one method, focus. So click is not there, right? So when we use object.create, we create a new object, and the prototype of that object would be base HTML element, which has the focus method. Now we can call this object that is returned here, let's call that base HTML select element. So when we create an instance of HTML select element, its prototype will be base HTML select element, which is an empty object that is linked to base HTML element as its prototype. Let's have a look at this on the console. So I'm going to create an HTML select element. Let's inspect this. So here's the prototype. This is an empty object. This is an empty object that is returned from object.create. Okay. Now object.create uses what we pass here as the prototype for that object. In this case, the prototype is base HTML element or HTML element.prototype, which is an object with a single method, focus, right? So back in the console, here the prototype of HTML select element is an empty object. It doesn't have anything, but its prototype is the prototype of HTML element, where we have the focus method, okay? So with this implementation, we don't inherit the click method in HTML select element. Now, to fix this, instead of using object.create to create an empty object that has HTML element.prototype as its prototype, we need to new up an HTML element object, because in this object we have the click method. And this object has its own prototype where we have defined the focus method, right? Now, let me remove these comments. Let's go back in the console, create another HTML select element. So now here's the prototype. This is an instance of HTML element object. We have the click method, and in the prototype, we have the focus method. So with this, we can click a select element. We can also focus it. Now, technically here, I should also have set the constructor. So HTML select element.prototype.constructor. We set this to HTML select element. Why did I set it to HTML select element? Because I told you that this expression is kind of similar to new HTML select element. So we can create an instance of HTML select element like this, or like this, new HTML select element.prototype.constructor. Obviously, we're not going to use this former approach, but in your applications, if you have a function where you get a constructor dynamically, and you want to create an instance of an object based on that constructor, then you have to reset the constructor property. Now, in the next section, when we get to ES6, you will see that implementing inheritance is far easier in ES6. You don't have to worry about this complexity, okay? So that brings us to the end of this exercise.